Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the moderator of the next session, Sonia Muzikarova.
All right, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on strategic autonomy versus global supply. How to secure value chain is what we're going to be talking about for the next about 45 minutes. Just on a technical note, as throughout the forum, we'll be using Slido to address some of your most pressing questions, and we will be also engaging with you via live polls. So please join the conversation. You can do that in two ways. Either go to live.globsec.org, or you can do it through the official GLOBSEC app, where you'll be able to, on the one hand, submit a question, but also upvote one. At the end of this session, there will be a Q&A. You can submit your question, as I have said, via Slido, but we can do it also old school in a physical way. There's a standing mic over there, so just please raise your hand. And yeah, our great panel will answer your question. So let me just warm up here a little bit and open up the conversation. I think it's safe to say that disruption has been the leitmotif of this crisis. It has upended our health systems, our social systems, the way we work, live, function, school our kids, but it has also disrupted cross-border production processes, just-in-time manufacturing processes. We have seen delays in the delivery of supply, such as semiconductors, microchips in manufacturing, sending customers in a waiting mode. As a direct result of that, we have been hearing with increased intensity and amplitude about things like decoupling production processes from China, value chain shortening, localization, regionalization, even nationalization of selected strategic industries, especially in the context of the so-called EU strategic autonomy, which has been also resonating throughout the forum as a theme. And basically that's the idea of a stronger, more sovereign, autonomous and self-sufficient Europe. This has contributed to some extent to a renewed impetus that globalization is somehow harmful, or if not harmful, it's a suboptimal model for the global economy. We have been hearing that. And that its prime feature, which are the overstretched, cost-driven global value chains, increase our vulnerability to economic shocks. So these are some of the issues that I would like to debunk with our great panel that I will introduce in a bit today. Are global value chains, as we have known them to date over, has the pandemic full-on upended the logic behind them, or are we just witnessing a sort of transformation? Second, how should we underpin and secure global value chains for greater robustness and resilience? And third, how should these aims be reflected in the policy landscape? So as with the other panels, we're in a hybrid mode today. I will start with our virtual panelists. We have with us today Mr. Gordon Bainai, who is the partner at Campbell Lutyens, based off of London. Gordon, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very well.
Great, thanks. Next, we have Mr. Thomas Wieser, who is the EU representative to the G7 panel on economic resilience. Welcome, Thomas, and hello to Vienna.
Thanks very much. Greetings to Bratislava.
Thank you. And next, we have Mr. Sebastien Miroudot, who is the senior trade policy analyst from the OECD, normally based off of Paris, but I understand today you are not in Paris, Sebastien.
Right, I'm in Seoul in South Korea today.
All right, great. And with me physically to my left, we have Mr. Michal Krupinski, who is a senior advisor at Warburg Pincus LLC, based off of London. Hi, Michal, and welcome. All right, so let us dive into the conversation and lay some groundwork here. Gordon, I will start with you. I would ask you to lay out and create a map of for us of some of the key drivers of post-COVID deglobalization, and also what are some of the potential macroeconomic consequences for Europe, but also maybe specifically for the region of Central and Eastern Europe, since we know that this region is very closely knit in manufacturing global value chains, please.
Thank you very much, Sonia. So, first of all, the disruption didn't start with COVID, and I would be very careful to base my analysis on what happens because of COVID. I believe that COVID has not changed the directions and trends that were already ongoing in the world. What it means is it has accelerated significantly those trends that were pre-existing. One of the most important of such trend is a fight against or a turn back from globalization. There are domestic political reasons for that in many regions in the world, in the United States, as we see under with the emergence of Donald Trump and Trumpism as a whole. Also, China's status in the world is changing from a pure low-cost manufacturer to a much more complex economic status, moving away from an export-led economy. These factors have been pre-existing COVID. There is another even more important geopolitical shift, which is that the United States now, the hegemony, the leading role of the United States in the world is very seriously challenged by an emerging China. This has been a long trend, but this is now realized, and that is leading the world towards less interdependence and more sort of bifurcation at the minimum. Now, this was the underlying trend. And globalization has taken a certain revenge on employment and on the politics of these countries. And what this COVID has accelerated is the tendency to turn back from that. What is very typical after there is a global crisis is always the reaction is to solve the crisis is always on the shoulders of the given states, nation states or regional governments like the EU. And that typically means that the role of the state is increasing versus the private market actors. This has happened after 2010. And usually this increased role of the state is quite sticky. State is not easily walking back from its strengthened and augmented position when the crisis ebbs. So it happened in 2010, and some of it is still alive. And COVID has significantly strengthened this process of making states' regulation stronger. So the practical consequences for our world is, in the coming years, I would expect that state will be more important than private sectors. That's completely different than the period between 1998 and 2010. State more important than private sector. The second is strategic considerations will be more important than efficiency. That goes against the super efficiency just-in-time deliveries of the global economy. Strategic autonomy will be much more relevant. If Europe realizes that more than 90% of our anti-fever pills, paracetamol pills, are coming from India, you may think it's not sustainable and you want to bring it home, just to give you a very simple example. But think about chips produced in Taiwan and the fight for the influence over the Taiwanese chip manufacturing industry, which is at the moment slowing down even car manufacturing, just to say the most obvious thing. So strategy will be more important than the global efficiency. Also, in general, regulation, the power of regulation will overrule the forces of market much more than before. We see it in, for example, tax changes that were just agreed by the G20 based on the OECD recommendations. But if you think about data regulation in the world or climate change related regulation, these regulations are sometimes going against the pure business logic. And that is going to stay with us for quite a while. And that will have an important impact on supply chains. So the strategy, the geopolitical strategy and the domestic political, internal political considerations will mean that governments will overrule the global economy and try to focus on their regions. I expect there will be 3 regions dominantly in the world: China, and its world. If China can find allies, because China in the past had very big difficulties of building long-term standing strategic alliances. The other region where regionalization of industries and supply chains will concentrate is the US and its world. And then there is a big question, and it's a big task for all of us, is whether Europe can still become the third relevant region of concentration and focus in the world. In this changing world, the stake for Europe is to stay at the negotiating table where the rules in the world are set. Because there is an old saying in politics, if you don't sit at the table, you will be on the menu. And that's what Europe should avoid.
Thank you very much, Gordon. But still, to push us on this and set the record straight when it comes to the macroeconomic picture, we do hear a lot of outcry about supply chain bottlenecks in the media and so on. But at the same time, the incoming information and data have been suggesting a very strong rebound in international trade, both in imports and exports, and not only in one region of the world, for example, in China or Taiwan, but also across the board in the US, in the Eurozone as well, which is seems to be recovering and faring pretty well. So also on top of this new information, the OECD and other international organizations have been revising up their global growth forecasts and other macroeconomic variables. So how do we actually square this strong trade rebound with these supposedly appended global value chains? It's to some extent, it's a bit counterintuitive. Sebastian, can you bring us up to speed here?
Yes. I think we have to look at the sequencing and what happened since last year. So when the pandemic started, the main concern was really a collapse in trade, many supply disruptions, followed by a deep recession. So the lockdown of the Chinese economy in February 2020 sends a signal that somehow global production could come to a halt. And at this time, maybe government in the EU or in the US did not expect to be hit by the pandemic. So the concern was really that production would be disrupted because there would be no access to inputs from Asia. But the Chinese lockdown was rather short, and progressively all economies were affected by the pandemic. The pandemic created many disruptions in trade, in particular in the transport networks due to the quarantine rules, also the reduction in air cargo that was supplied through passenger flights. But at the end, it's not global manufacturing that was the most affected, and not Asia, where somehow governments, on average, let's say, were more successful to contain the pandemic than governments in the rest of the world. So the main impact of COVID-19 has really been a shift in demand, not just a reduction or a decrease in demand. There was an important increase in the demand for the goods needed to fight the pandemic. Of course, medical goods, such as the face mask, ventilators, or more recently, the vaccines. But the lockdowns and the stay-at-home policies have also shifted demand from the in-person services. You can think about the restaurants, catering services, entertainment, hairdressing, and so on, to the goods and services you need when you work from home, so such as IT goods, e-commerce, or delivery services. So global value chains have adjusted, and there was even a trade boom for these products in the second half of 2020. We have seen more trade and more reliance on global value chains because the in-person services that were less demanded are kind of service, because they are services, they are less traded, while the medical products, the IT goods involve trade and GVCs. So we had an economic shock, we had a recession, but we have this paradox of having more trade, but really for a very limited set of products. So today we can say that GVCs have been rather resilient in the sense that they have recovered quickly, even after this extraordinary shock that was COVID-19. So it confirms what we have seen in the past, for example, after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011, or the floods in Thailand the same year. So we have to understand that resilience is not about avoiding disruptions, because whatever you do, you will face crisis, but it's about recovering quickly. But the type of disruptions that GVCs are still struggling with today are not so much about inputs not delivered, but simply the challenge of increasing production. It was a story at the beginning of the pandemic for face masks. It's still the story today for the vaccines, and beyond medical products that it was mentioned, it's also the issue with semiconductors now. But to quickly ramp up production, I really believe you need this global value chain. And if you think about the vaccines, they are really a GVC story with cooperation among different firms in different countries. It would not have been possible to develop these vaccines so quickly and to produce them at a large scale without a global production. But of course, it's still not enough. So there are policy questions. But I would think that the alternative and relying less on GVCs would have put us in a worse situation than where we are now.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Turning now to my only physical panelist and partner in crime, Michal. You're an advisor to a global private equity firm, and your mission centers on building durable companies with sustainable value. When you square this objective of building durable companies with what we have seen on the global value chain front, but also with the macro picture that we have discussed that has been presented, how do you square this? Do global value chains actually require a major overhaul to achieve this mission?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sonia. And maybe before I respond directly to the question, let me make a couple of comments.
Sure.
My perspective is also a perspective of someone who was at the board of the World Bank during the past global financial crisis. This crisis was different because it was self-inflicted with lockdowns to a big degree, and the response was different. But first of all, as Prime Minister Balnay was saying, I think what we saw last year is nothing new. It's just a reflection of economic reality, where you do have a lot of regions in the world that simply are no longer strong in terms of manufacturing. What we saw was a big surge in demand, and in my personal view, a delayed policy response and a delayed response from many governments in terms of making sure that the medical supplies are there. This reminds me, there was a small scandal in Switzerland where they asked a 21-year-old person who actually delivered a lot of medical equipment to some of the governments in Europe. They said, how come did you do that? And he was saying, I was just watching TV in December of 2019, and I saw people wearing masks in China. And I come to a conclusion that this will come to Europe, and that's why I bought quite a big shipment. So what happened was many of the governments simply didn't see it. And that's why there was this panic effect, which for me also speaks to the fact that you do not have proper coordination. And as we all know, all of us who studied EU, we do not have proper coordination and policies in terms of healthcare and security on the EU level. And what we have seen is, to a big degree, the EU going from one extreme to another, which is moving from a deficit of supplies to a surplus, moving from a deficit of vaccines to a surplus of vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the impact will be profound. Unfortunately, it was to a big degree self-inflicted. The panel is not about the rationale of lockdowns. My view is, after Chinese lockdown, there was no other way for governments not to introduce lockdowns. But bear in mind that this huge state intervention, which is unparalleled, it's much bigger than during the global financial crisis. In terms, people saying, 15 trillion pump into the global economy, which certainly led to a bubble of everything, asset price bubbles last year, as we all saw with, all across the board. This will lead to increased inflation as well as inequality going forward, and particularly in what we call Western Europe and the US. Of course, the trouble is it was to a big degree self-inflicted. Now, two last points, and I answer your question. So first of all, what does it mean for Europe? I think an increased rationale for coordination in terms of healthcare policies, because you did see, vans being stopped on borders of EU countries which very much spoke to the lack of proper solidarity in Europe. Secondly, for Central Eastern Europe, I think it's actually good news, because when I talk to investors, it's first of all, we are here in the part of the world where we think it still makes sense to manufacture, which is a good thing, and not everyone thinks this way in the world. And secondly, people, it's all, we all have, short memories, but many investors ask themselves questions in terms of how they allocate capital, particularly those who invest and can allocate in manufacturing globally. And apart from, where it makes sense from a cost perspective, a more diversification approach is actually at play, which I think will mean increased investments in this part of the world. So I think it is positive. And now to answer your question, of course, I think what will be happening is every rational business person will be taking a view around the business continuity, around the long durability of existing business models for all companies. So I think all businesses are affected. And whenever you analyze a business, you run a business, you have to take a view and say, what if it happens again? Mm-hmm. Right? So we do have events which are sort of fat tail bear curve events, but they do happen. And I think it's in this regard, it is a lesson for everyone, and it is a lesson also for investors.
Thank you very much. Switching gears now a little bit from the business side to the policy side, and this is a question for Thomas. Thomas, from your viewpoint as the EU representative to the G7 panel on economic resilience, a very pertinent role for this debate. Can, in your view, global value chains be redesigned for greater resilience? And what's the role of policy here, both perhaps national, regional, and global? Not an easy question, but necessary.
Thanks very much, Sonia. And I think it's good that you don't frame it in the context of the pandemic, because just as an example, as far as we know, the Evergreen didn't get stuck in the Suez Canal because it had contracted a virus, but for other reasons. And the effects were, of course, quite spectacular. And when we were looking at reasons and possible policy responses, we have remarked that most global value chains have shown fairly significant resilience and dynamism also during the pandemic, but that the recent events have highlighted the gap in our collective risk identification mechanisms and in the resilience of certain sectors which are critical to public goods such as health or security or environment. And because there has been a lack in risk identification, there was a significant lack in preparedness. So many countries, and I think the G7 are at the forefront there, many countries are having a critical look at their national approaches on how to address these challenges. There is, of course, always the danger, as already mentioned, that you try to solve the last crisis and not the next one, even though everybody is saying next crisis will be different, we don't know where it's coming from, but nevertheless, the approaches tend to piggyback on solutions found over the last crisis. But the point is that true resilience, in the view of the panel, which just reported to G7 leaders, true resilience does arise from reliable and diverse and codependent global supply chains. And that presupposes, of course, a high degree of openness, a high degree of underwriting, fair degrees of competition. And that is why one shouldn't now panic and move to policies of trying to duplicate each and every potentially critical sector in every part of the world. But there are certain sectors where there is a convergence of criticality on the one hand, public goods that I've mentioned, and vulnerability on the other hand. Now, where do these vulnerabilities stem from? Some of them have already been mentioned, and I think we need to make the distinction, a very clear distinction between manufacturing sectors and service sectors, especially new technologies. And in manufacturing, indeed, we have seen, for reasons of politicization of trade, weaponization of trade, a ticking up, not least under the former President Trump, a ticking up of protectionist measures. We have seen the issue that systemic convergence, which was the hope of many when China joined the WTO, systemic convergence has not come about, but has rather shown, we have rather seen systemic divergence, and therefore fair degrees, fair conditions of competition with state-owned enterprises have more and more moved to the forefront of discussions. And this will be exacerbated as we move into policies which are necessary, i.e. carbon pricing. How can we live in a world where there is no globally agreed principle of carbon pricing? It will lead to certain border measures, which inevitably will give rise to tensions. That's as far as manufacturing is concerned. But on new technologies, I see a significantly more pronounced trend on decoupling, not least because of the monopolistic market structures that are inherent in many of these sectors. The issue of data privacy, the issue of data governance, and who is the driving force behind developing standards and rules. And that is the clearest danger that I see to a jointly run, governed, rules-based, international, global, open trading system, namely that we move into an era where there might conceivably even be two sets of standards. And that would be lethal. It might start from the area of new technologies, but inevitably it would morph over into trade in goods and some other services. So what can one do? I think one needs to, recognize that these systemic divergences and differences will persist for the foreseeable future, and one somehow has to find an algorithm on how to coexist and compete peacefully with each other without shutting down the globalized trading system that has benefited all of us. We need a better national and better international mechanisms and fora to identify risks, build, for example, common vulnerability indicators and methodologies, share best practice, and we need a forum that provides for policy coordination in times in critical times, that ensures a comparatively free flow of critical goods and services. So therefore, all things hang together. This provides another strong rationale for overhauling the WTO, a strong rationale for overhauling, of course, the WHO. But if we look at supply chain resilience proper, and that is what this panel is about, we suggest that one focuses on three critical areas for now: health, critical minerals, and semiconductors. And one needs to branch out, build out from the G7, from the G20, to reach as many other countries as possible, so as to build up global chain resilience, if you so want, policy resilience. And for me, that is one of the lessons which I take from looking at around Europe. There has been, over the years and over the decades, a progressively weakening of the capabilities, capacities of the public sector. Very many of the administrations have been woefully unprepared and very, very unprofessional. So a strengthening of the quality of public administrations, depoliticizing them would be of the essence. And I'm afraid that the present sentiment in many parts of the world, but unfortunately also in Europe, is not for depoliticizing and professionalizing these sectors. But without that, the next crisis will have just as hard a hit as the last pandemic. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this rich account. I think we have built a very nice groundwork here. First talking about the driving factors behind deglobalization, then discussing the current picture, the macro story here, and then some of the private sector and policy responses. I would like to pause here and launch Slido, actually our first poll. So if that could come up on the screen. And I would love for you and our virtual audiences as well to engage and answer the multiple choice question. The most effective coping strategy multinational firms should use to minimize future disruptions, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, of their supply is, and you have 4 options: shortening and streamlining their value chains, diversifying their supply base, going from global to regional, concentrating their sourcing regionally, and D, no systemic step can ward off a disruption of such scale and scope. It'd be great if you could weigh in on that. We'll wait a couple of minutes and we should see some first responses, hopefully on the screen. Great. So it seems to be pretty clear. Our audiences think that diversifying the supplier base of multinational companies is the most sensible approach. But let's have our panelists weigh in here on that. Turning to Sebastian again. Speaking of coping strategies, you and your colleague Sebastian have published an interesting paper and also an article on Vox EU, I believe, debunking 2 qualities of value chains. One is resilience and another one is robustness. What is the difference, and should they both be targeted by on the one hand, supply managers, on the other hand, by policy? How does this fit into the overall debate and picture?
Yeah, so you can have different definitions of resilience, but a common definition you find in particular in the business literature is the capacity to recover quickly after some large-scale disaster. So in this sense, GVCs have been resilient. That's the experience of the pandemic. But resilience in this sense does not mean that you avoid disruptions or shortages, just that it takes a shorter time to recover or to solve the issue. So for some essential goods, and here you can think about electricity or medicines or access to telecommunication networks, it may not be enough just to recover quickly. There should be some continuity of supply, and this is what we call robustness, the capacity to continue to produce during a crisis. I mean, firms can also work on their robustness, and it can also be an objective for supply chain managers, in particular when this continuity of supply is important for their consumers. But I think that, as Thomas explained, there is certainly here maybe a role for governments to help firms to ensure the continuity of supply through specific regulations, in particular addressing maybe the cost and the economic incentives for firms to be in a position to continue to supply during the crisis. It can be also through stockpiles, strategic stockpiles, just to provide the goods while waiting for firms to recover. You can think also about contingency plans, specific agreements between governments and firms, so that some firms will switch to the production of essential goods during a crisis. So I think an important lesson from COVID-19 is that in the future, governments should be better prepared. Again, really along the lines of what Thomas explained, look at different risk scenarios, have some indicators on bottlenecks, vulnerabilities in supply chains. And this is something the G7 has been working on with some report drafted by OECD. And OECD and other international organizations, together with government, will certainly continue to draw lessons, identify best practices, and see in particular how international cooperation can bring this kind of robustness in value chains.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I actually had a lot more questions for our speakers, but we have less than 10 minutes left. So I'll just do one last question very quickly, 1 minute each of you. And my question is, against the backdrop of this EU debate on strategic autonomy and perhaps greater self-sufficiency, can this be Europe's opportunity going forward? Can Europe win from all of this, for example, by, I don't know, reshoring parts of production home through technological advances or something similar? Maybe, Michal, starting with you, can this be Europe's opportunity in your view?
No, sure. I think, and Sebastian just alluded to that. I think the argument that says we are investing in people, we are training specialists in vaccines, doctors, we are investing in technologies for ventilators and pharmaceuticals. And in the end, we cannot, in times of stress, when people are dying, we cannot actually impose anything on those companies. I think it is a valid argument. And you did see it in EU. You saw it with the largest pharmaceutical companies and ventilator producers in Switzerland during the pandemic. And I think we have to remember European corporates are the biggest investors. European companies are the most international companies of all companies in the world by any standards. And I think in this regard, if there is this in-depth reflection, I think it does indeed pose a big chance. I think it is a chance. Having said that, you cannot solve new problems with old methods. And very much to the point that was made by Thomas, is this lack of institutional capacity, lack of an ability to react very quickly. And in this regard, I would very much be in favor of a new recovery plan, which is more bottom top than top bottom, because you should be really able to see from bottom top what are the real problems. It seems to me that the new policies are a little bit too much top bottom in this regard in terms of policy response and recovery.
Okay, great.
Thank you for the beep.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, Thomas, 1 minute, and then Gordon, and then we move to the Q&A.
For me, it's quite clear. What the next generation EU can and should do is to have significant institutional reforms and not just be something where you invest. And that is how we will become more resilient. And each and every government will have to do that by itself. But I see very few governments where politics is willing to let go of the principle of independent, professional, and high-quality administrations.
Thank you. Gordon.
I think the EU could be coming out well, but there will be a K-shaped recovery, not just among industries and companies, but among nations and regions around the world. And whether Europe will be on the downward part of the K or the upward part of the K will depend on whether we can forget about our previous policy of strategic naivety and replace it with enlightened self-interest and realize that we have to be a bit more carnivore and less herbivore in a world where every other major region and trading partner or economic or political partner is behaving much more assertively. So that means we need to create Europe as Europe's biggest offer in this competition globally is its market, is its 450, 60 million people, very high value market. We have to be more selective of how we offer this to others, but we should push for cooperation because that's our self-interest. But we also have to, the market is not enough strength in this global political competition. We need to bring up our foreign policy, and the toothless foreign policy has to get toothed by a defense policy. And we also need to change the whole fiscal setup of the EU. We need much more fiscal coordination at the European level, and we have to be able to protect our industries. Ultimately, for us Europeans to keep our European way of living in the next century, Europe is Noah's Ark, which can help us to survive the flood of global rebalancing. But whether this ark floats or sinks depends pretty much on the next 10 years' actions.
Thank you very much to all of our excellent panelists. I don't see any questions submitted via Slido, so I would maybe ask our physical audiences, and maybe we can do it old school. If you can raise your hand if you have any questions. Anyone in the room? There's a standing mic, don't be shy.
I think we covered all the topics.
We covered all the grounds, right, didn't we?
Or maybe we were not controversial enough, I don't know.
Or maybe that. Still no questions via Slido. Okay, let's do something else. I will ask my producer to pull up the second poll, and maybe people can weigh in there. This is a word cloud poll, and it says, please describe in one word, the first thing that comes to mind, and also that is most all-encompassing, what recent turbulence in cross-border production means for the future of the European economy. So we would have our audiences to weigh in on the same questions that we have posed to our speakers. So it can be anything: resilience, autonomy, dependence, winner, loser, stronger, weaker, whatever comes to mind. It would be great if you could engage, and we should see some results on the screen, what our audiences think these developments mean for the future of the European economy. All right, we see flexibility, progress, opportunity, decreased influence. All right, progress is the most typed in term to describe what it means for the future of the European economy. Okay, well, that's not bad at all. If it's opportunity. All right, great. I would hereby conclude today's session. We have looked at several layers of how to secure value chains. We took stock of the deglobalization drivers, the macroeconomic picture, discussed whether building durable companies requires a major global value chains overhaul, and also how can policy help underpinning resilience of global value chains. We also discussed some coping strategies and pondered whether recent developments are indeed Europe's opportunity going forward. Thank you very much for the great panel, for their insights, and also to our audiences for not so lively discussion, I might say, but for the nice engagement in the live polls. And stay tuned for the themes surrounding economic recovery on the GLOBSEC website and social media. Next up, we have in Habsburg at 12:15 a session called Big Tech and European Regulations. And right now in this room, we will be live streaming Maria Theresia's stage with a session, Geopolitical Europe at Crossroads, Western Balkans in the post-COVID-19 era, with ministers of foreign affairs from Croatia, Macedonia, and Slovenia. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.